It's all yours.
It's all mine?
Yep.
Okay. Jerry, as a youth, what sort of music did you listen to?
Blues and jazz. I should reverse that. Jazz and blues. In my case, the jazz influence came first.
And then I understand that you were an avid record collector. How did that all get started?
Well, I was so wrapped up, so immersed in music, that the only avenue to continuity of enjoyment was records. There were a lot more live venues then, in the 30s, way back when they had giant ferns on the earth. And there were places you could hear bands and small combos. But the record was coming into its own. And we would go foraging for old records, for old Bessie Smiths, King Oliver, Louis Armstrongs, in junk shops, Salvation Army depots, most unlikely venues. Cellars where they had bad dog signs. And record collecting became a passion with a whole bunch of people back then. But it was really collecting, because you had to go out and find the original 78. There were no compilations. They didn't put them on LP. It's wonderful today because you don't have to do all that legwork. And it's one of the great tributes to the medium that all of the great music is being made available again, at least great quantities of the classic jazz and blues.
Do you still have a large part of your collection?
No. I had thousands of 78s, and with the intervention of World War II and moving around and coming from one place to another, they just dwindled. And I gave the last of my collection to the man who was probably the most famous record collector in the world. That's Bob Altshuler of CBS Records. Bob used to work for me at Atlantic. Bob has so many records that he had to build not an adjunct to his house, but a second house in Huntington, Long Island, to house his collection.
That's
so
amazing.
I gave him my last couple of thousand.
When in the 30s, you were talking about it being an exciting time. What were some of the exciting venues to go to in New York at that time?
There were three main areas. There was Harlem. There was 52nd Street, otherwise known as the Street, to its habitués, and there was the Village, Greenwich Village, and you had the great swing bands, and I was particularly interested in the black bands, such as Fletcher Henderson, Jimmy Lunsford, Erskine Hawkins, Duke Ellington, and small combos on 52nd Street, where they featured soloists, people like Ben Webster, and of course the wonderful Billie Holiday singing with small combos. And Dizzy Gillespie was starting out on 52nd Street, and the John Kirby small combo and so on. Occasionally they'd put a whole orchestra, a whole Count Basie band in a little place like the famous Door. And I want to tell you that thing vibrated, you know, with a low ceiling. And then the third place I mentioned was the Village, where you'd see more Chicago, New Orleans, and Dixieland, places like Eddie Condon's and Nick's. So it covered these three areas. 52nd Street, you wouldn't recognize it today with all the huge office buildings, was just one long series of brownstones. And in the basements, they had these clubs. And they were really small. And it was just boiling with talent. You'd go from one place to another and see the most spectacular performers. And the emphasis there was on small band swing.
It's amazing because I've never heard of 52nd Street before being a music venue area. You always hear of Harlem and you hear of the Village. This is the first I've heard of.
Well, it's still called Swing Street. If you look, go to the corner of 6th Avenue and 52nd, they got one of those little signs up. They call it Swing Street, which it's fine, but we always thought that sounded a little precious. So being real hip, we called it the Street. Man, we're going to make it to the street this evening, you know.
In that era, and going to those venues, is there any one particular night you remember as being outstanding?
Well, I remember a lot of nights. I remember one night going to see John Kirby at the Onyx Club with Maxine Sullivan, and the great drummer Chick Webb, who had his own famous orchestra. He was Ella Fitzgerald's sponsor and nurturer and founder. Chick Webb came in and sat in on drums, and the regular drummer in the Kirby band was a very good drummer named O'Neill Spencer. Well, Chick Webb is probably one of the greatest drummers of all time. In fact, Whitney Balliet, who I think is the most marvelous critic, had a piece in the New Yorker just a couple of weeks ago about the great drummers, and he mentioned Chick Webb, Sid Catlett, and Davy Tuff. Well, after Chick Webb got through smoking those drums, O'Neill Spencer went back to the traps, took out his handkerchief, and he cooled out the snare drum and the bass and the cymbals. And there was a night I saw a battle of music at the Savoy Ballroom. They'd bring in a big band. They'd bring in a white band from downtown, from outside, and pit that band against one of the local champ. The king of the Savoy Ballroom was always Chick Webb. Plus a small band they had called the Savoy Sultans, who could play the slowest music that you ever heard and still keep it together without falling apart, which is a great art. It's one of the arts that's been lost in the current music, playing slow and seductively. Well, it was a battle of music between Chick Webb and Red Norvo. And Red Norvo had a marvelous band, and his vocalist was the great legendary Mildred Bailey, who was his wife. They were billed as Mr. and Mrs. Swing. Another promotional thing, you know, but people need these rubrics to hang on to. And it was a fabulous night. Of course, Chick Webb cleaned them out, no question. And people were fainting on the floor, and it was hot. And then there were all the jam sessions that they used to have in those days. Every Sunday, a great fellow named Milt Gabler, who founded Commodore Records and who was the A&R director of Decca Records for many years, ran a jam session on 52nd Street at Jimmy Ryan's. And every Sunday, you would see the Pantheon. It was incredible. It was $1 for admission if you had the buck. If not, you know, he used to let us in on a promise. And then you'd see everybody from Louis Armstrong, Bobby Hackett, Pee Wee Russell, Edmund Hall, like the Valhalla, you know. And we appreciated it, but we took it for granted too. And in retrospect, I got a lot of that stuff, but I wish I could go back. I snarf up a lot more. It was just all around, and it's all gone.
Yeah, it's unfortunate how sometimes when you're living through experiences, you take them for granted,
Right.
and you look back and you
You
go,
don't know when you've got good conditions like that.
When you were at Billboard magazine, when Billboard referred to black music, they referred to it as race music.
There were several categories. At one time they called it race. One of the other trade papers, the Cash Box, had a listing called Hot in Harlem. The record companies had other designations such as Ebony Series, Sepia Series, and other such designations which reflected color perceptions.
You came up with the term R&B. How did you come up with that?
Rhythm and blues. Well, the other fellas on the staff and I, our editor was Paul Ackerman. I got to get these names in, even if they don't resonate too much with the general public, but they were very important to me. Tony Wilson and Hal Webman and I, we decided that we needed to clean up the term and get a better designation. We just sat around, everybody came in with an idea, and rhythm and blues seemed to have the right swing, the right resonance. So just one week, instead of saying race series, it said rhythm and blues, and we changed it like that.
You were certainly one of the people who have been most responsible for making sure that music doesn't have a color. And I'm sure that there was a time when you were very much in a minority. How did you deal with that?
Oh, it hit me where I lived because I was a partner in a small record company called Atlantic Records. And Atlantic operated on the premise that we were going to specialize in a kind of music in which we could thrive and survive, or by which we could thrive and survive. That meant we had to go to black music because with the major record companies, while they did address black music, they did it on one foot and casually. There wasn't a heavy effort. And we saw a vacuum there. We and a lot of other companies, independents, and this was in the late 40s and early 50s, after World War II. The big band period was over. Bands were out of favor. Restrictions on travel had helped kill the band business. And also because of the war, there was such a commingling of influences that it became the global village. Marshall McLuhan had it absolutely right. Some farm boy from Arkansas met a blues singer from Mississippi. Some folk singer from Florida met a jazz guitarist from New York. And suddenly all of this came together, and out of it came rhythm and blues. Country music was percolating. And there were no records, not insufficient records to meet the new demand. So there's a vacuum, and in our marvelous free enterprise society, the wherewithal emerged to meet the need, the vacuum. First there was the demand, and then the records. So Atlantic Records was founded to make black music by black artists for black adults, very specifically. So we had blues, we had urban good time music, honky-tonk music, a lot of jazz-inflected rhythm and blues. And we did very well, I'd be so bold as to say. And we just seemed to keep advancing. But the music was compartmentalized and categorized. And as everybody knows, what makes hit records is radio play. We couldn't get our records on the radio, not on the pop radio stations. You having a problem?
Yeah.
You running out of tape?
When you touched your leg, it popped our microphone.
Oh.
You were making a very good point.
Oh, okay.
It popped
All right. But we're functioning. Okay. So we couldn't get our records on the radio, but we got them on the black radio stations, which had sprung up to serve the needs of the black community. And of course, the black radio stations had a restricted audience. It was a black audience and far less in numbers than the big white market. So, but our music was beginning to emerge, and people were looking at our music, white people, white singers, and what would happen, if we would do something like Shake, Rattle, and Roll by Joe Turner, Bill Haley would jump on it and get it played on the white stations. Or we'd do Tweedledee by Laverne Baker.
We are getting we're getting
Distortion?
Okay, there wasn't a question. He's been talking for about 3 minutes.
right. It was only the last 30 seconds.
Well, I think I have an idea. Let me pick it up.
Yeah.
All right, ready?
Are we rolling? Fine. Everything's fine.
Our problem was getting our records played on the white radio because people would jump on our records and cover them. They would even take our records into the studio and put them in the control room and have the engineer and producer literally copy the arrangements and the sounds. So Georgia Gibbs jumped on a record like Tweedledee by Laverne Baker, and Bill Haley on Shake, Rattle, and Roll, where we did the original with Joe Turner, and of course Shaboom by the Chords, which was covered by the Crew Cuts. And it did get irksome to see us losing the sales in the big market. Of course, that changed with as time went by, and there was a social evolvement, there was a consciousness raising, and we finally had our shot.
What was your first crossover record into the white market?
The real first crossover record was a white record. It was Bobby Darin's record of Mac the Knife. And people didn't know he was white. And he was, in fact, our only white artist. And it was Bobby Darin's record that finally managed to project us into the big ball game, because one thing led to another. A lot of that had to do with the sagacity and perspicacity of my partner, Ahmet Erdogan, because Bobby Darin had been on the label and made about 6 sessions and nothing happened, and everything was getting old and tired in the Bobby Darin department, and he walked in with a song called Splish Splash. And I said, "This is an amusing piece of garbage," and Ahmet said, "No, it's a hit." So he went in and cut Splish Splash with Bobby, and it was a hit. And then he cut Mac the Knife, and Bobby was established, and now we had a foothold in the pop market, in the white field. And what would happen, Bobby would do a session in California. Ahmet would meet some people in California, like Nino Tempo and April Stevens, Sonny and Cher, Stephen Stills at the Buffalo Springfield. The whole market opened. And then eventually Atlantic got into the British picture with things like Led Zeppelin and Yes and the Rolling Stones. But our big crossover, really, it never really happened that our black music crossed over. Motown's music crossed over. In fact, it would hardly even be called a crossover. It went directly to the sensibility of the white teenager. Our records were beaming at the Negro, the black adult. And so while we had Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, the Sweet Inspirations, Chuck Willis, Joe Turner, an endless roster, Solomon Burke, Wilson Pickett, Ivory Joe Hunter, the Coasters, the Drifters, on and on and on. And we never went platinum with any of those records. And now, I may be busting somebody's bubble talking about this like this, but that's the truth. We got into the big market when we addressed the big white audience. If everybody that I met today had actually bought the Ray Charles record he told me that he bought when he was a kid coming up, we'd be quadruple platinum up to here. But it's something that is more talked about than done, the purchase of these records. And in the long run, that's what counts, going into the record store and buying it.
In those days, how many units constituted a big seller, Jerry?
It's the same as today, you know, how high is up? I know when I came into Atlantic Records in 1953, there were 4 partners, and we had a staff of about 6 people, and 2 floors of a small building with a creaky elevator. And in order to meet the payroll and for us to take home our princely salaries and have a recording budget and also be able to pay the pressing plant, we had to sell 60,000 singles a month. It seems absurd other times. It almost feels like it would be fun to go back to that period, you know, start over, like reducing a drug addict, reducing his tolerance, you know, start clean again. Then, of course, once you get a hit, you're insatiable. You sell 500,000, you want 1 million. You sell 1 million, you want 2 million. And then, of course, we got into the multi-platinum years with Led Zeppelin and things like Inagata Davida so on. But we always enjoyed what we did. Depots, most unlikely venues, cellars where they had bad dog signs, and record collecting became a passion with a whole bunch of people back then. But it was really collecting, because you had to go out and find the original 78. There were no compilations. They didn't put them on LP. It's wonderful today because you don't have to do all that legwork, and it's one of the great tributes to the medium that all of the great music, that the only avenue to continuity of enjoyment was records. There were a lot more live venues then, in the 30s, way back when they had giant ferns on the earth. And there were places you could hear bands and small combos. But the record was coming into its own. And we would go foraging for old records, for old Bessie Smiths, King Oliver, Louis Armstrongs, in junk shops, Salvation Army.
Action is all yours.
It's all mine?
Yep.
Okay. Jerry, as a youth, what sort of music did you listen to?
Blues and jazz. I should reverse that, jazz and blues. In my case, the jazz influence came first.
And then I understand that you were an avid record collector. How did that all get started?
Well, I was so wrapped up, so immersed in music. Music is being made available again, at least great quantities of the classic jazz and blues.
Do you still have a large part of your collection?
No. I had thousands of 78s, and with the intervention of World War II and moving around and coming from one place to another, they just dwindled. And I gave the last of my collection to the man who was probably the most famous record collector in the world. That's Bob Altshuler of CBS Records. Bob used to work for me at Atlantic. Bob has so many records that he had to build not an adjunct to his house, but a second house in Huntington, Long Island, to house his collection.
That's
so
amazing.
I gave him my last couple of thousand.
When in the 30s, you were talking about it being an exciting time. What were some of the exciting venues to go to in New York at that time?